All right, it is now time for our first talk. So, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce a phenomenal youth changemaker for our first youth presentation. A biotech innovator and high school student, Rania Hashim is a 14-year-old alum innovator at the Knowledge Society, motivated by her vision of a cleaner, greener future and making it a reality by learning and developing emerging technologies like cellular agriculture and biotechnology. She has done projects in the alt protein space, AI UX design, and is currently working towards neurotech. Rania's talk will focus on how animal free dairy could change the game in tackling climate change. Over to you, Rania.
Thank you so much. I hope you can see my screen. Okay. So, hi, as introduced, I am Rania and I go by the pronouns she, her. So, as mentioned, I'm an alumni at the Knowledge Society who is motivated by my vision of a cleaner, greener future and making it a reality by learning and developing emerging technologies like cellular agriculture and biotech. So, I've actually done projects in the space and have done extensive research for over 5 months about the technology, and I'll get down about like my work later. But before we begin, I would like to thank you all so much for being present in my talk. I really appreciate it. Today, I'm going to be talking about how cellular agriculture, which is an emerging technology, can solve 25% of humanity's biggest threat. Yep, you guessed it, climate change. So, before we dive into the juicy part, I want to share a little story with you. So, when I was a little kid, my favorite snack was chicken nuggets. But incidentally, it was also the snack that I was most curious about. Why, you ask? Well, let's just say chicken nuggets look nothing like actual chicken. I was curious so as to where the bones were and how they were put into different shapes, like star dinosaurs and fishes. And seeing my family hens just hopping about like it's nothing only made my suspicion go a little higher. And after persistent questioning, my mom explained to me that we did not require a whole chicken for making nuggets. So, as this curious 4 year old grew older, there was this thought that developed that why were we investing so much energy, time, and resources into growing a whole chicken when we could just grow the required parts? Now, oops. Okay. Now, that is really just today's topic, but before we dive onto that, let us talk a little bit about the food system. Now, that brings me to my first point. Meat production is only 3 to 5% efficient. So, despite the amount of feed being given, they're not being converted very effectively. If we were to be considering cows a technology, they are pretty inefficient. On top of that, we have the immense wastage of resources. So, to put things onto perspective, to produce 1 liter of milk, we require 6 football fields worth of land, which is not a pretty good ratio. This also contributes to the destruction of the Amazon. Secondly, we have the ethical consideration. Animal raised for the industry is subject to terrible conditions, forceful impregnation, and cruelty. And thirdly, we have world hunger. So right now we are feeding half the world's grain crop for animals to raise meat, eggs, and milk instead of directly giving it to humans. And this is a significant waste of natural resources, including fossil fuels, water, and land. And to link it directly with today's topic, 25% of climate change comes from food production. So this means that if you're solving this problem, we are quite literally going to be solving 1/4 of the actual overarching problem of climate change. Right now, veganism is something which is gaining popularity, and I've actually had some of my friends convert as well. However, in my opinion, such is based on a scarcity mindset. So when I talk about scarcity mindset, I'm referring to viewing life as this one finite chicken nugget instead of figuring out how we can get more. So we're focusing on the lack of something and how can we can conserve it instead of focusing on how we can get more of it or alternative methods to sustain that experience. Another point is that this relies on mass behavior change, which is practically impossible. Thankfully, we have a solution to this: cellular agriculture. Cellular agriculture is a novel technology, and as you can see from this word breakdown, it has something to do with cells and farming. So, cellular agriculture basically refers to methods and processes that are used to grow agricultural products like meat and milk via cell cultures. Now, there are actually two types of cellular agriculture. The first one being cellular agriculture itself, and the second one, acellular agriculture. Okay, fine. Maybe the names are a little uncreative, but the concept will leave you spellbound. So, cellular agriculture, let's dive onto that first. So, it's basically when we use cell cultures to produce products that have living or once living material present in them. So, this can include meat and milk and so, not milk, sorry, meat and so on. So, let me illustrate the process with an example. So, meat is basically, the main constituent of meat is muscle tissues. So, our objective here is to make that. So, we start off with these cells we call myosatellite cells. And these cells are nothing but a fancy word to refer to cells that give rise to muscle cells. So, we get these and let them multiply. And then we filter them, clean them, just make it, purify it. And cells have a habit that they need to stick on to surfaces. And usually this is present in the body of the animal. But since we are growing this in a cell culture, we need to provide an external system. And this is what the ECM does for us. The ECM is another word for extracellular matrix. So, anyway, these cells grow in a whole cocktail of nutrients that is basically the growth medium. This part of cellular agriculture actually still needs research, and as current limitations make it unethical. Anyway, these myosatellite cells become something called myoblasts as we play around with the factors and manipulate it, and finally they form a muscle cell, and these are known as myocytes. Now, myocytes love making friends, and so with the perfect environment, they go around and fuse with other myocytes to form myotubes. And then these come together to form a muscle fiber, which again come together, they multiply, and all of these come together to form meat. Now, if we were to be scaling this process, tackling all of the limitations and stuff, we'd be experiencing significant decrease in the use of resources and the release of greenhouse gas emissions, which sounds awesome if you ask me. Anyway, now it's time to go to the next part, which is acellular agriculture. Interestingly enough, my main research has been centered onto this field. So this is basically using cell cultures to make products that do not have any living material, which does feel kind of weird. But actually, these are composed of proteins and sugars and stuff like that. Now, an example I'm going to be taking you through is milk. Now, if there's one thing every STEM researcher needs is a first principle lens. We can't, keep seeing things as they are. But like we can't see milk as this random white liquid. No, we need to break it down to its parts. So, milk is mostly composed of water with sugars, lactose, and proteins, the most prominent of which is whey and casein. So, these are the elements that make milk, well, milk. So, to produce these, we're going to be using a microbe, but I'm going to be letting you guess it. So, what does beer, bread, and fermented soybeans, known as natto, have in common? So, if you guess yeast, you're absolutely right. All of these are fermented, and so this is the special secret ingredient that we are going to be using to make our milk. So, let's imagine you're a yeast cell, floating around, fermenting stuff like it's nothing. Then you become two yeast cells, then four, and now you're used to this fission, you're just like speed running the way through life, and you're doing things your way. But let's hold on there. What if there was something else inside that yeast? Would that something else also get replicated? Short answer is yes. So this makes it pretty convenient for us to sneak in some extra fermentation instructions. And the way we do that is through plasmids. So plasmids are these circular pieces of DNA that act as our tools to be a little sneaky and give in some extra instructions. We could engineer plasmids to tell the yeast to produce prominent milk proteins like whey and casein. So we start with the plasmid, and we have these sites on the plasmid known as restriction sites. Now there are molecular scissors called restriction enzymes that cut at these sites, so like right here, and help us insert the gene. And a good way of thinking of these is as a search engine. So they go around the whole plasmid looking for the exact sequence, and they, make a cut there. And once we got the SNPs, we can insert the gene, which is basically, in our case, the gene that directs the yeast cell to ferment whey and casein proteins. And the resultant plasmid right here is known as recombinant DNA. So we have the yeast, we induce the cell to take it in, and we finally get the modified yeast. And the cells that didn't take in the plasmid, yes, that is a case scenario, die. So these yeast multiply, and as they feed on certain specific things, they produce the necessary proteins. Yay! So now I simulated the DNA cloning through a research and design platform called Benchling. So I got to get some experience with working with these tools, and my end product was this plasmid I constructed, which codes for the fluorescent protein, as you can see right there. All in all, it was a great experience, and I learned a lot of new things through this. Now, if this was performed for this purpose, then we'd be able to have up to 97% less land, 99.6 less water, and 65% less greenhouse gas emissions, which is a drastic difference. Now, my work is not only focused on biotech, but also creating content and direct involvement. So, I'm actually advising and providing insights to Perfect Day Foods to help them maximize their impact and to help them fulfill their mission of building a more diverse food system for everyone. Also, my second one is demystifying cellular agriculture, which is a wiki that I'm making with the intention of sparking public dialogue on the topic to make people more receptive to the idea, because a lot of people have this mindset that it's something out of the labs, and there's just a lot of stigma around this, and I think this will really help deconstruct some of those. I'm also having a series on my Medium where I break down how each product can be made using cellular agriculture. Anyway, wanted to extend a huge thank you to Youth STEM 2030 for the amazing opportunity to speak on this topic, and also thank you so much for giving me a stage to present this. Eternally grateful. Anyway, if you have any questions, I'm excited to hear them as it's now time for the Q&A. Also, if you do have any other things, feel free to reach out to me through any of my socials. Always happy to share some knowledge. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Rania, for that very informative session and for all the insight you provided. So, as said, everyone, feel free to express your appreciation or any questions for Rania through the chat so that we can take a look at those. But before we get started, so I have a question for you, Rania. So you mentioned that you started off with, I believe it was TKS, and where uh, gained some more insight on what you wanted to look into. But overall, what really inspired you to, look into bioethanol energy, or to even start looking into tackling climate change with dairy products?
Well, I actually started off in the activism space, so it's kind of like just a second. Okay, so I actually started off in the activism space where I learned more about like veganism, but then I also kind of realized that this wasn't a very practical method because of the financial barriers some people have and like the nutritional barriers some people have. And so I kind of broke down the topic onto a first principle lens, and then figured out that there was a technology. And the way I kind of gained more exposure was actually DKS.
Oh, okay, that's nice. And I like the fact that you sort of broke it down, because we need to sort of get understand what the root cause for some things are and get to that foundation of it so that we can build upon that. So that's definitely a great point, and lots of applause and appreciation for you in the chat, because overall it truly was a very informative talk. So, this is sort of another overlying question that we had. So, overall, within your journey, were there any sort of prominent challenges that you faced? And if so, how did you overcome them?
I mean, I did have like challenges in like, how I mentioned about my work mainly being focused on lab grown dairy. Because initially at the time, I didn't find that there was like a lot of information on that, like, deep information. It was mostly focused on meat because around that time it was like releasing and stuff. And also to do the project, it was kind of difficult in the start. So I needed to, get access to the right resources and direction
Right.
and all of that.
So, how were you overall able to get that? And are there any, online resources that you think you could recommend?
I mean, as of for the like getting onto it, I kind of contacted people, so I started like
Mhm.
doing cold outreach and stuff, and they kind of gave me a whole different perspective and so on. So That is one point. Another one, I actually use like university YouTube channels because they have a lot of like, a lot of like knowledge bombs in there.
They certainly do, and that's another great point, cold outreach, I think that's, becoming more popular nowadays, but it's so helpful. You never know, what sort of help or information that you can receive from reaching out to someone like that. So
Yeah.
that was, as you can see, lots of, praise in the comments. So we have a question from, Akin Sanya. So what are the best 3 tips for next upcoming change makers?
Well, the first one I think would be to like, get on to like social media in terms of like LinkedIn and stuff, because a lot of youth have this sort of stigma around it, thinking that they're just for professionals. But a lot of the opportunities that I've hustled actually came from LinkedIn. So that's probably my number one. And also don't be afraid to like send messages, kind of going to the first one. And the second one, I would say, is that mindsets are actually more useful than skill sets at some point. Because if you have those, then it really helps you develop those skill sets and like stay at a problem better. And, depending on what you define as a mindset. The third one is probably just to put yourself out there, like you can optimize for serendipity if you're, putting yourself out there, talking about projects you're doing and being open, like building in public essentially.
Those are 3 very good points. I mean, overall, just as you said, putting yourself out there and during events like this where you can meet other youth through LinkedIn, you can type it here, you can talk to others. So, those are 3 phenomenal points. Everyone can ensure that they, chat in the chat or within the comments. And overall, thank you so much, Rania, for your talk. So, before we continue, that is a wrap for session number 1.